"Sir, this is not a place for browsing," the manager said, his voice just loud enough to turn heads, just sharp enough to draw a line that did not need to be repeated, and the boutique fell into that quiet, polished kind of silence where judgment travels faster than words, where every glance carries meaning, and Darius Coleman paused just inside the doorway, not startled, not offended, simply still, as if he had stepped into a moment he had already seen before, the polished marble floors, reflecting the soft golden light from above, the glass cases lined with watches that cost more than most people in the room would admit out loud, and behind them, the staff moved with practiced elegance, greeting some customers with warmth, others with distance, and the difference was subtle, but it was there, always there. And Darius noticed it the way he noticed everything, quietly, without shifting his expression, his dark tailored suit clean and precise, his posture relaxed but grounded, his presence neither asking for attention nor avoiding it, just existing with a calm certainty that did not announce itself. And the manager, Ethan Clark, stepped forward with a controlled smile that did not quite reach his eyes, his gaze sweeping once from Darius's shoes to his face, measuring, calculating, deciding, and that decision had already been made before he spoke again. "If you are looking to browse, I would recommend our online catalog," he added, softer this time, but no less dismissive, and a couple standing near the display to the right slowed their conversation, not turning fully, but listening. The woman's eyes flicking briefly toward Darius before returning to the glass case as if nothing had happened, while a younger sales associate behind the counter hesitated, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the display, her attention caught between protocol and instinct, and Darius did not respond immediately. He let the words settle in the space between them, not absorbing them, not rejecting them, just allowing them to exist, his gaze moving slowly across the boutique, taking in the arrangement, the lighting, the placement of the most expensive models at eye level for certain customers, slightly higher for others, the choreography of luxury designed to feel natural but built on layers of silent decisions. And then his eyes returned to Ethan, calm, steady, present. "I am interested in a specific piece," he said, his voice even, measured, carrying no trace of irritation, and that alone created a slight shift, not enough to change the room, but enough to be noticed, because it did not match the role he had just been assigned, and Ethan's smile tightened just a fraction, the kind of reaction that only appears when expectation and reality do not align perfectly. "Of course," he replied, though the word felt more like a formality than an invitation. "Which piece would that be?" And Darius took a step forward, not toward Ethan, but toward the center of the space, his movement unhurried, deliberate, as if he belonged there without needing to prove it, and the air adjusted around that movement in the smallest way, a shift that no one would acknowledge but everyone would feel, and the moment, already set in motion, began to deepen, not with noise, not with conflict, but with something far more precise, something that would not reveal itself all at once, but would unfold step by step, until there was no room left for doubt. The air inside the boutique did not return to normal after his words. It shifted, slowly, almost invisibly, as if the room itself was reconsidering something it had already decided, and Darius Coleman stood there with that same quiet composure, his gaze moving not with curiosity, but with precision, taking in the arrangement of the displays, the positioning of the highest value pieces, the subtle differences in how staff approached each customer, and it became clear that this was not his first time in a space like this, not his first time observing how access was controlled without ever being openly denied. And across from him, Ethan Clark maintained his posture, but something in his expression had tightened, just slightly, the kind of shift that appears when a situation refuses to follow its expected path. And he gestured toward a glass case near the wall. "Most of our premium inventory is reserved for clients with established purchase history," he said, his tone polished, professional, but carrying a boundary that had already been drawn, and a man browsing nearby paused long enough to glance over, his eyes briefly moving between Darius and the watches before returning to his own selection, while the younger associate behind the counter adjusted her stance, her attention no longer split but fixed, as if waiting for something to happen that she could not yet define, and Darius stepped closer to the central display, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, the gold accents of the boutique lights catching the edge of his watch, understated but precise. And he spoke again, his voice steady. I am looking for the platinum day-date with the ice blue dial. And the specificity landed differently. Not loud, not confrontational, but exact. And that exactness carried weight, because it was not the language of someone browsing. It was the language of someone who knew exactly what they were asking for. And Ethan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before recovering, his smile returning, though thinner now, more controlled. That model is not currently available for display, he replied, his tone measured, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the back office door, a movement so quick it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. And Darius noticed, not reacting, not acknowledging, simply registering it. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with observation, with small details aligning into a larger picture. The way the associate's posture had shifted from passive to alert, the way the couple near the right display had slowed again, their conversation now secondary to the interaction unfolding in front of them. And Ethan took a step to the side, subtly positioning himself between Darius and the intersection of the boutique, a movement that was not aggressive, but intentional, reinforcing a boundary without stating it. And Darius stopped just short of that line, his gaze meeting Ethan's once more, calm, unhurried. Then perhaps you could check, he said, and the sentence, simple as it was, carried something more than a request. It carried expectation, not of service, but of accuracy, and that distinction created another shift, small but undeniable. Because it suggested that the conversation was no longer about access, it was about correctness, and correctness in a space built on precision is not easily dismissed. And Ethan's posture adjusted again, the control he had established at the beginning now requiring effort to maintain, because the man standing in front of him did not fit the role he had assigned. And the longer that misalignment continued, the more visible it became, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, steady presence of someone who did not need to raise his voice to change the direction of the room. The space between them tightened, not because anyone raised their voice, but because something in the interaction had begun to slip out of its expected shape, and Ethan Clark felt it before he fully understood it. The subtle shift that happens when control is no longer automatic but has to be maintained. And he straightened slightly, adjusting his stance as if posture alone could restore the balance. As I mentioned, he said, his tone still measured but carrying a sharper edge now, those pieces are allocated to select clients. And the word allocated hung in the air, carefully chosen, designed to sound procedural rather than personal. But its meaning remained clear, and Darius Coleman did not respond immediately. He let the word exist for a moment, his gaze steady, almost thoughtful, as if considering not the statement itself, but the structure behind it. And then he spoke, his voice calm, precise. Then you should already know whether it is available, he said, and the sentence landed differently, not as a challenge, but as a correction. And that distinction was enough to shift the dynamic again, because it redirected the conversation away from access and toward competence. And competence in a space defined by expertise is not something that can be easily defended with tone alone. And Ethan's expression tightened, just enough to be noticed, his eyes flicking briefly toward the display behind him before returning to Darius. And for the first time since the interaction began, there was a pause that did not feel intentional. It felt unplanned, and that pause created space. And space in a controlled environment allows other elements to move in. And behind the counter, the younger associate glanced at the terminal screen, her fingers hovering for a moment before she began typing, her movements quiet but purposeful, as if responding to a signal that had not been spoken out loud. And a man standing near the entrance shifted his weight slightly, no longer pretending not to watch, while the couple to the right slowed again, their attention fully engaged now, because the interaction had crossed into something else, something that no longer fit the pattern of a simple dismissal. And Ethan noticed the attention, the way the room had subtly oriented itself toward the exchange, and he stepped slightly to the side, reestablishing his position between Darius and the back area, reinforcing the boundary with a movement rather than a statement. I can assure you, he continued, his tone firmer now, if it were available, it would not be on the floor. And the statement was meant to close the conversation, to restore the hierarchy that had been established at the beginning. but it did not land the same way this time, because the foundation it relied on had already begun to shift, and Darius took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, simply reducing the distance by a fraction, enough to change the geometry of the interaction, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. "Then I would suggest you confirm that," he said, and the words, simple and direct, carried an expectation that did not align with the role he had been given, and that misalignment deepened the tension, not through conflict, but through contrast, because the man standing in front of Ethan was not asking for permission. He was asking for accuracy, and accuracy leaves very little room for interpretation, and behind them, the soft tapping of keys continued, quiet but persistent, like a detail that would soon become impossible to ignore. And as that sound filled the brief silence between words, the moment moved forward, not with force, but with inevitability. Each small shift bringing it closer to something that could no longer be contained within assumption alone. The sound of typing did not stop this time. It continued in a steady rhythm behind the counter, quiet but persistent, like a detail that refused to stay in the background any longer, and Ethan Clark heard it even as he tried to maintain control of the moment. His attention split between the man standing in front of him and the subtle shift happening just behind his shoulder, and that split, small as it was, weakened the certainty he had relied on from the beginning, and he adjusted his stance. Again, grounding himself in the role he knew. "There is nothing to confirm," he said, his tone firmer now, less polished, more defensive, as if repetition alone could stabilize what was beginning to move, and Darius Coleman remained still, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, not pressing, not retreating, simply present in a way that made every word spoken feel measured against something larger than the interaction itself. And that presence created pressure, not through force, but through contrast, because the more Ethan insisted, the more visible the gap became between assumption and reality, and behind them, the younger associate paused, her fingers hovering above the keyboard for just a second before she looked up, her eyes moving from the screen to Ethan, then to Darius, and back again, as if confirming that what she was seeing matched what was unfolding in front of her, and the hesitation in her movement was enough to draw attention, subtle but noticeable, and the room responded in small ways. The man near the entrance shifting slightly closer, the couple to the right no longer pretending to browse. Their focus now openly directed toward the center of the boutique, and Ethan felt it. The way attention had shifted, the way the interaction was no longer contained between two people, but had expanded into something observed, something that carried weight beyond the moment itself, and he turned slightly toward the associate, his voice lowered but edged with urgency. "Is there a problem?" he asked, and the question, though directed at her, was meant to restore control, to pull the situation back into a familiar structure, but she did not answer immediately, her gaze returning to the screen, her posture straightening as if aligning with something she could not ignore, and that silence, brief but loaded, did more than any response could have, because it introduced uncertainty where certainty had been expected. And uncertainty in a space built on precision is not easily dismissed, and Darius watched it all without interruption, his stillness now functioning as a constant, something that did not shift even as everything around it began to adjust, and that constancy made the changes more visible, more defined, because it provided a fixed point against which everything else could be measured, and Ethan turned back to him, his expression tightening, the confidence he had started with now requiring effort to maintain. "As I said," he began again, but the words did not carry the same weight, not because they were different, but because the context had changed, and context is what gives authority its strength, and without it, repetition becomes noise, and the associate finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to interrupt the moment. "Sir," she said, directing the word toward Ethan, and that alone shifted the dynamic again, because the direction of attention had changed, and Ethan paused, just long enough for it to be noticed, and in that pause, the structure of the interaction began to give way, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, undeniable shifts that pointed toward something already taking shape, something that would not need to be announced to be understood, because it was already there, waiting to be recognized. The word lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because of what it implied, and Ethan Clark turned slightly toward the associate, his expression controlled but strained, as if the situation had moved just outside the boundaries he was used to managing. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, sharper, no longer addressing a customer but attempting to re-establish internal order. And the associate hesitated for only a brief moment before turning the screen slightly in his direction, her posture no longer uncertain but aligned with something she could not ignore. And though the details on the screen were not visible to anyone else, the effect was immediate. Ethan's eyes narrowing just slightly as he processed what he was seeing, his expression shifting not dramatically, but enough to register. And Darius Coleman remained exactly where he stood, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady, as if the unfolding moment required nothing from him except patience. And that patience carried weight, because it suggested certainty without needing to declare it. And the room felt it, the subtle tightening of attention, the way conversations had fully stopped now, the way every movement had slowed just enough to make space for what was happening. And Ethan straightened again, but this time the movement lacked the effortless authority it had carried before. It felt measured, deliberate, as if he were adjusting not just his posture, but his understanding of the situation. "There must be an error," he said, the words controlled but edged with something new, something closer to doubt than confidence. And the associate shook her head slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "The profile is active," she replied, and that sentence, simple as it was, introduced a contradiction that could not be easily dismissed, because it did not challenge his authority directly. It challenged the foundation it was built on, and in a space like this, where everything depends on accuracy, that kind of contradiction demands resolution. And Ethan's gaze flicked once more toward the screen, then back to Darius, and for the first time, there was a pause that did not feel strategic. It felt necessary, as if he were recalibrating in real time. And Darius watched without reaction, his expression unchanged, offering no guidance, no explanation, only presence. And that absence of reaction made the moment heavier, because it placed the responsibility entirely on Ethan to resolve what he had started. And behind them, another staff member had stepped closer, their movement subtle but intentional, drawn by the shift in tone, by the quiet signal that something in the system had not aligned with expectation. And the boutique, once defined by smooth transactions and controlled interactions, now held a different kind of energy, one that moved beneath the surface, precise and unavoidable. And Ethan spoke again, but this time his voice carried less certainty, more caution. "Give me a moment," he said, turning slightly toward the back office. And the words, though simple, marked a change, because they acknowledged that the situation required verification beyond his immediate control. And that acknowledgement, small as it was, shifted the balance once more. And Darius did not move, did not follow. He simply remained where he was, composed and steady, as if the moment had already begun to resolve itself, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the quiet alignment of fact and recognition. And as Ethan stepped away, the space he left behind did not close. It expanded, filled not with tension, but with anticipation, because something had been uncovered, something that would not return to where it started. And the room, without a word being spoken, knew that the direction of the moment had changed, and it would not be changing back. The space did not reset when Ethan Clark stepped away. It held its shape, stretched slightly by his absence, as if the room itself was waiting for something to return with him, something that would either restore the balance or confirm that it had already shifted beyond recovery. And Darius Coleman remained where he stood, neither advancing nor retreating, his posture unchanged, his presence now the only constant in a space that had begun to quietly reorganize itself around him. And the staff, once moving with seamless coordination, now carried a subtle awareness in their movements, glances exchanged in passing, small adjustments in position, each one acknowledging that the moment had moved beyond routine. And near the entrance, the man who had been browsing earlier stepped slightly closer, not enough to intrude, but enough to witness more clearly. While the couple to the right no longer pretended to examine the display, their attention fixed, openly observing, and the younger associate behind the counter kept her gaze forward now, no longer uncertain, but aligned with what she had seen, her posture steady, as if she had crossed an internal line from hesitation to certainty, and the seconds passed without urgency, but not without weight, each one adding to the quiet anticipation that had settled into the room. And then the back office door opened, not abruptly, but with purpose, and Ethan returned, his pace measured, his expression controlled, but different, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but in the subtle tightening of his features, the slight recalibration in how he held himself. As if he were carrying information that required adjustment, and behind him, another figure appeared, older, composed, dressed with the same precision as the environment itself, someone whose presence did not need to be announced to be recognized as authority, and that presence alone created a shift, because it introduced a new point of reference, one that existed outside the interaction that had been unfolding. And Ethan stepped slightly to the side, no longer fully occupying the space between Darius and the interior of the boutique, a movement small enough to seem incidental, but significant enough to be noticed, and the new figure's gaze moved directly to Darius, not scanning, not assessing, but recognizing, and that recognition, though silent, carried more weight than anything that had been said so far, because it did not question. It confirmed, and the room responded to that confirmation in the smallest of ways, the kind of shift that does not make a sound but changes everything. And Ethan remained still for a brief moment, his role no longer clearly defined, his earlier certainty now replaced by something more measured, more cautious, and Darius did not move, did not acknowledge the shift outwardly, his composure intact, his presence steady, as if the unfolding moment required nothing from him except patience, and the distance that had once been maintained between him and the rest of the boutique now felt different, not closed, but recalculated, as if the lines that had been drawn at the beginning were being quietly redrawn, not through argument, not through explanation, but through the alignment of recognition and authority, and in that alignment, the direction of the moment became unmistakable, not yet fully revealed, but no longer uncertain, moving forward with a quiet inevitability that could not be reversed. Recognition does not announce itself. It settles into a space quietly, changing everything without needing to explain why. And as the older man stepped fully into the boutique, his presence carried that exact weight, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, his gaze fixed on Darius Coleman with a clarity that removed any remaining uncertainty from the room. And in that single, steady look, the dynamic that had been building beneath the surface finally reached a point where it could no longer be mistaken, because recognition is not something that can be faked. It either exists or it does not. And here, it existed completely, and Ethan Clark felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle but irreversible shift in alignment. The way his position in the space no longer held the same authority it had just moments ago. And he stepped slightly back, not retreating, but adjusting, as if making room for something he had not anticipated, and the older man moved closer, his posture composed, his expression respectful. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice calm, professional, but carrying a tone that reflected more than routine courtesy. It carried acknowledgement, and that single sentence, simple as it was, traveled through the room with more impact than any raised voice could have, because it confirmed what had only been implied until now, and the effect was immediate, though still controlled, the kind of reaction that happens in small, precise ways, the associate behind the counter straightening further, her earlier uncertainty replaced with quiet certainty, the customers near the displays shifting their focus completely, no longer observers of a dispute, but witnesses to a realization, and Ethan remained still, his expression tightening, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the foundation he had relied on was no longer stable. And Darius inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the greeting without changing his composure, his presence remaining exactly as it had been from the beginning, steady, unforced, and in that steadiness was the clearest indication of what had just been revealed, because nothing about him needed to change now that the truth was visible. It had been there all along, and the older man continued, turning slightly toward Ethan. "I was informed there was a question regarding availability," he said, his tone still even, but now carrying an edge of precision that mirrored the environment itself. And Ethan's response did not come immediately, the pause small but significant, as if he were recalibrating not just his words, but his understanding of the entire situation. "I was not aware," he began. But the sentence did not complete itself with the same certainty it would have held earlier, and that incompletion spoke louder than any explanation, because it acknowledged a gap, a misalignment that could no longer be ignored, and Darius remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, his restraint reinforcing the shift more effectively than any statement could have. And the older man gave a slight nod, as if confirming something already understood. "The piece you requested is indeed available," he said, directing the words toward Darius. And in that confirmation, the final layer of assumption fell away, leaving only fact, clear and unambiguous, and the room settled into a new configuration, one defined not by perception, but by recognition. And in that configuration, the roles that had been assumed at the beginning no longer held, replaced instead by something far more precise, something that did not need to be declared, because it had already been revealed in the quietest, most undeniable way. The confirmation did not echo, it settled, precise and final, and the effect moved through the boutique in a quiet wave, not visible in any single action, but undeniable in the way everything adjusted around it. And Ethan Clark remained still for a moment longer than he intended, his posture caught between what had been and what now was. The confidence he had carried at the beginning no longer supported by the structure he had relied on. And in that space, small details became louder, the way the associate behind the counter shifted her stance to a more attentive position, the way another staff member stepped forward slightly, as if aligning with a new point of authority, the way the customers who had been watching no longer tried to conceal it, their attention fully present, not drawn by conflict, but by realization. And Darius Coleman stood exactly as he had before, his composure unchanged, his expression steady, as if nothing in the room required adjustment from him, because nothing about his position had changed, only the perception of it. And the older man moved with quiet efficiency, signaling subtly to the associate, who immediately turned to retrieve the requested piece, her movements now precise and deliberate, guided not by uncertainty, but by clarity. And Ethan's gaze followed the motion briefly, before returning to Darius. And in that look there was no longer assumption, only the recognition of a miscalculation that could not be undone, only addressed, and even that would not be immediate, because moments like this do not resolve through apology alone. They resolve through process, through alignment, through the quiet correction of what had been out of place. And the associate returned, carrying the watch with the kind of care reserved for something that holds more than value, placing it on the display with controlled precision, the ice blue dial catching the light in a way that drew attention without demanding it. And the older man stepped slightly aside, allowing the space between Darius and the piece to remain unobstructed, a gesture that spoke without words. And Darius moved forward, just enough to close that distance, his gaze lowering briefly to the watch, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with familiarity, as if confirming something he already understood. And then he looked up, not at the watch, but at the space around him, at the alignment that had finally settled into place. And in that moment, the boutique was no longer divided by assumption, it was defined by recognition, and Ethan stood just beyond that center, his role no longer leading the interaction but existing within it, recalibrated, reduced to observation rather than control. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, because everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed, not through force, not through declaration, but through the quiet, undeniable clarity of truth aligning with reality, leaving nothing else to be questioned. The moment did not demand a reaction. It settled into a quiet finality that carried more authority than any declaration could have. And Darius Coleman stood there with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, his gaze resting briefly on the watch before lifting again, not seeking approval, not acknowledging the attention around him, simply existing within a space that had finally aligned with what had always been true. And the older man remained at a respectful distance, his posture steady, his role now clear, not to lead, but to support the reality that had been confirmed. And across the boutique, the energy shifted once more, not dramatically, but completely, the subtle tension that had defined the earlier moments dissolving into something quieter, more precise, more grounded in understanding. And Ethan Clark stood just outside the center of it, his earlier confidence replaced with a stillness that carried recognition rather than control, his gaze no longer scanning for authority, but settling into the acceptance of what had been revealed. And no words were needed to define that shift, because it existed in every detail, in the way the staff now moved with quiet attentiveness around Darius, in the way the customers who had watched the interaction now turned away slowly, not out of disinterest, but because the conclusion had already been reached, and there was nothing left to question, and the associate remained near the display, her posture aligned, her focus steady, as if aware that she was witnessing something that extended beyond a single transaction. Something that would shape how every future interaction in that space would unfold. And Darius reached forward, his movement measured, not hurried, not hesitant, simply precise, as he acknowledged the piece before him. And then he spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying no trace of what had come before. "I will take it," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried weight, not because of what it expressed, but because of what it confirmed, that the moment had resolved exactly as it needed to, without excess, without reaction, only through the alignment of truth and recognition. And the older man inclined his head slightly, signaling the next steps with quiet efficiency, while Ethan remained still for a brief moment longer before stepping back fully, no longer occupying any part of the interaction. His role now clearly defined by absence rather than presence. And in that absence, the final shift completed itself, not through removal, but through realignment. And as the process moved forward, seamless and controlled, the boutique returned to its natural rhythm. But it was not the same as before, because something had been established, something that would remain, shaping every future moment with a clarity that did not need to be repeated, because once recognition takes hold, it does not fade. It becomes part of the structure itself, guiding everything that follows with a quiet, undeniable certainty that requires no reinforcement, only understanding.